So, I don't know if you've picked up on this, but the last couple of years have been hmm, maybe not the best. And as quarantine measures continue to keep being a thing, I find myself deeply possessed by wanderlust and craving more and more media that is immersed in the beauty of nature and features quiet moments of respite. And without actually realizing it, I've been gravitating towards a subgenre that I was aware existed but not actually familiar with, which is Iyashike. Iyashike, literally translated as healing, is a specific version of the slice of life genre that features characters living peaceful, carefree lives, and is classified by its healing and rejuvenating effect on the audience. Stories in this genre are usually light on narrative stakes or conflict and instead tend to focus on subjects like family, friends, and domestic living. Azumanga Daioh, Flying Witch, Natsume's Book of Friends, Yotsuba, Sweetness and Lightning are all examples of the Iyashike subgenre. The Iyashike genre came into prominence in Japan after 1995 due to the aftermath of the Great Hashin earthquake, several terrorist attacks, and an economic recession. As the country experienced multiple mass traumas one after another, it caused the sudden upheaval of people's lives, leaving them worried, facing an uncertain future, and thus the craving for comfort and security in media deeply increased. This is why the most recognizable entry in the Iyashike genre for the last 2 years has been the life simulation game Animal Crossing New Horizons, which keeps breaking unprecedented sales records. And now it's the second best-selling game on the Switch console at almost 35 million sales, only slightly under Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which was released for the Switch in 2017. Which seems like a pretty obvious sign that we could all use a bit of healing right now, and probably will into the future, possibly even especially post-quarantine. Now, what a person considers to be healing is going to be different for everyone, which is why the genre tends to overlap with other slice of life elements like comedy, romance, and cute girls doing cute things. Personally, I really enjoy series about cooking. Sweetness and Lightning is absolutely one of my top comfort anime, and my favorite entry in the Fate franchise is today's menu for the Emiya family, which is another wholesome cooking series. But because quarantine has kept most of us trapped at home for the last 2 years, I want to bring attention to series where the appeal is in the atmosphere and focuses on the beauty of nature. So, in no particular order, here are several healing atmospheric anime to watch during quarantine. Yokohama Shopping Log. Yokohama Shopping Log is a series that simultaneously has so much and yet so little going on, it makes it difficult to describe clearly. On the one hand, it's about a very sweet, slightly airheaded robot running an out-of-the-way cafe in the countryside. And on the other hand, it's about the scattered remains of humanity continuing to live their lives after a practically world-ending catastrophe. And both of those concepts coexist in perfect tandem with one another. A post-apocalyptic landscape probably seems like a weird set choice for what is a main staple of a genre that's supposed to evoke a healing response from the audience, but it's surprisingly effective for a couple of reasons. It's in the Ghibli/Nausicaa vein of apocalypse, where it's been long enough since catastrophe that people have adjusted, and humanity has quietly settled into its twilight era, far removed from the pell-mell pace of modernity and hustle culture. Because the story starts after the landscape-altering disaster has already passed, it means that there are a lot of questions about the world that will forever remain unanswered to the audience. Most of the world building is conveyed not through expository dialogue, but through environmental storytelling. Obviously, something happened, as we can clearly see that the sea levels have drastically risen, resulting in coastal cities like Yokohama slipping underwater, along with other major environmental changes like the eruption of Mount Fuji and the seasons becoming less defined, which makes the world's seemingly peaceful appearance stand in jarring contrast to the casual manner in which people are armed. Not to mention that sentient humanoid robots are fairly common, such as the main character, Alpha, who runs an out-of-the-way cafe while she waits for her beloved owner to return to her. Exactly how the world came to be this way is significantly less important than the people and how they choose to live in it. Alpha, for the most part, doesn't really seem to mind that she's living in a post-apocalypse. Other than, being isolated and feeling a little lonely sometimes because she lives in a remote area and is more or less confined to her home, and the changing landscape keeps increasing travel restrictions, meaning she hardly ever sees new people. But other than that, Alpha herself is very sweet and charming. She just has this really friendly manner and pleasure in living that makes her very endearing. But that's partially because being a robot means that there's a certain amount of privilege behind Alpha's lifestyle. For starters, she's effectively immortal and may end up outliving the rest of humanity. It doesn't matter if her cafe only gets a couple of customers because she needs much less to live on than a human would. This separation from humanity is Alpha's greatest strength and weakness. It gives her the ability to look at the world's problems from afar in a safe place with almost absolute security, yet it also means that she can't walk along the same path as everyone else, and eventually she's going to be left behind. There are only 2 episodes of the original OVA with about an hour of total runtime, and if I try to describe the plot, it makes it seem like nothing really happens. In the first episode, another robot, Kokone, hand-delivers a camera to Alpha, and the rest of the episode is spent on Alpha going out and trying to find something to take a photograph of, but she gets too lost in the moment to actually end up taking any. That's basically all that happens, which is totally fine because there is so much love put into depicting that scenery. Outside of the opening and ending sequences, there's almost no music. It's all just natural background noise, like ocean waves crashing against the shore, the hum of Alpha's motorcycle engine as she speeds by, and birds calling in the distance. Yokohama Shopping Log is a beautiful example of how stunning pre-digital animation could be. The palette is absolutely lovely and features these soft, cool blues, greens, and pinks. So much care was put into depicting how the light changes the atmosphere throughout the day, from the cool, subtle blues of early morning, the rich, vibrant hues of midday, and the warm glow of the sunset as it slowly descends into nightfall. And what's really cool is that the places mentioned, like Enoshima, are real and are more or less still recognizable even if they're not currently underwater. Alpha's Cafe is located on the Miura Peninsula south of Tokyo and the Yokohama area and Mount Fuji. Maybe I'm just a sucker for ruins that have been overtaken by nature, but I absolutely adore the scenery in Yokohama Shopping Log. Unfortunately, this series is also an excellent example of the rocky transition from traditional cell animation being overtaken by digital, and the initial steep learning curve as animators had to work in a groundbreaking new medium they weren't used to. Although a later OVA adaptation, Quiet Country Cafe, was produced only a mere 4 years after the first OVA, the drop in quality is noticeable. Obviously, there's a clear style change as character designs become more, for lack of a better term, anime-y, simplified in a way that's easier to draw and mass produce. Gone are the attempts to create a somewhat defined nose in favor for the simple anime nose line. But the real loss for me is the color palette. This is kind of a general problem in the early 2000s anime scene, but with hand-painted cells, there were a limited number of pigments actually available, which meant you had to be careful when designing a character's color palette. But with digital, the sky's the limit, and this new freedom made the early 2000s color design a little overzealous. Most series didn't stick to a unified color palette, which is why it makes me so sad to see highlighter green grass and MS Paint blue skies. But that being said, Quiet Country Cafe being a bit lackluster isn't a total loss, since the OVAs barely managed to scratch the surface of the world developed in the 140-something chapters of the manga. Be warned though, the manga only raises more questions as the world opens up and more of its oddities are explored, such as the enormous spacecraft circling the Earth. But there aren't any clear answers to those mysteries, so don't go in expecting any. There's also some undeniable sapphic energy between Alpha and Kokone, even if, again, nothing substantial comes of it. So if you like the anime and are looking for more, the manga is worth getting into, although there currently isn't an official English translation available, so do with that what you will. Specifically, in regards to quarantine and everything, Yokohama Shopping Log hits a lot different in just how isolated and lonely Alpha's existence is. The healing nature of Yokohama Shopping Log is kind of surprising in that it actually comes from its premise being set after the fall of modern civilization. What should have been a world-ending event is now just a distant memory. Things change, people die, but life goes on and humans can recover from almost anything. The simple fact that people are happily living their lives in what we would consider to be a ruined world is, by nature, extremely hopeful and comforting, especially considering how much the last several years have been an ongoing dumpster fire. So much so that the apocalypse bingo meme has been used, frankly, way too much for comfort. In the wake of what is a landscape-altering calamity, it's nice to be reminded that humans can bounce back from almost anything. My Neighbor Totoro. So if you're watching this video, there's a high probability that you're already familiar with My Neighbor Totoro and may have seen it once or many times before, but just in case you haven't, My Neighbor Totoro is about a father and his 2 daughters moving out of the big city into the rural countryside to be closer to their mother, who is currently staying in a hospital for her health. When the younger sister goes exploring in her backyard, she meets a forest spirit, Totoro, that she ends up befriending and who helps out her family in need. What's kind of funny is, I always used to think this film was overrated. Maybe it's just because of how highly this film was praised, maybe it's because I only saw it a couple of times when I was much younger, but when compared to how much I adore other Ghibli films, I did not get this film. But now, 2 years into quarantine, I can safely say I don't feel that way anymore. Getting to both explore the countryside and the process of moving into a new home through the eyes of these 2 city girls who are experiencing it all for the first time is so charming. The film's setting takes place in roughly 1950s rural Japan, and the scenery and atmosphere is just lovely. Being set in the nostalgic past also adds an air of comfort and longing for simpler times long gone by. And the fact that the film is traditionally animated on cells and all the backgrounds are hand-painted lends an added air of nostalgia as opposed to the modern feeling of digital. When it comes to scenery, it's hard to beat Studio Ghibli, and the backgrounds might actually be my favorite part of this movie. The water is crystal clear, it's summer, and everything is bright and lush and green. You know the phrase, every frame a painting? That basically sums up this film. If I had to choose a favorite moment, while I really like the opening sequence when they first arrive at the house, I think it has to be the bus stop sequence. It's when the girls are waiting for their dad's bus to arrive, but it's running late. The pacing takes the time to slow down, and it's just this series of serene, tranquil moments with the sound of rain gently petering down. Joe Hisashi's music, combined with the quieter moments, are almost overpoweringly emotional, and there's just something about the revelry and the quiet beauty of nature juxtaposed with this family's utter joy that somehow makes me want to cry. Mushi-Shi. In comparison to the rest of these entries, Mushi-Shi probably seems like a strange choice because its premise teeters dangerously close to horror, and it definitely dips its toes into unnerving territory. And yet, somehow, it still manages to be one of the most zen anime I've ever seen. The series centers around creatures called Mushi, strange life forms that are alive in the way that very basic life forms like protozoa are alive. Think about animals in the way that sea anemones, coral, sea sponges, clams, and crinoids like feather stars are animals, in that they are practically alien compared to what the human understanding of an animal should be. Animals that evolved during the Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago and are just, still around. Well, Mushi are even further away from the human understanding of life than that, well past amoebas and tardigrades, so much so that they might as well be thought of as living energy. The Mushi are effectively spirits as they are invisible to the human eye, but when they come into contact with humans, they tend to cause some pretty serious side effects. There are many different types of Mushi with highly specialized traits that fill different ecological niches, and the nature of these side effects depend on which specific species of Mushi has infected its host. While some are symbiotic, most are parasitic. Some Mushi feed on humans, but some can appear as human or even turn humans into Mushi. But despite this, although Mushi often cause harm to humans, sometimes even killing them in the process, it's not because they're evil or are filled with ill will, they're just acting in their nature. Not all Mushi are even necessarily dangerous on their own, it's only when they interact with humans that they start to cause trouble. The story takes place in a fictionalized version of Japan between the Edo and Meiji period somewhere in the 19th century, and follows a Mushi-Shi named Ginkgo, a traveling Mushi expert that helps humans that have become entangled in the different types of Mushi. There is kind of an overarching story, if you squint, but really, most episodes are self-contained and merely use Ginkgo as a connective through line to explore the mysterious symptoms caused by the Mushi and how exactly it's affected the lives of these people it's come into contact with. Ginkgo has a good, maybe 70, possibly 80% success rate on whether or not his patient will make it out alive, but if they survive, they may not be entirely the same afterwards. So it does create a real sense of mystery and suspense, but without any actual fear or dread. You want Ginkgo to succeed, but if he doesn't, that's okay too. What I really like about Mushi-Shi is just being immersed in the beauty of the barely touched Japanese wilderness. From the mountains to forests to swamps, beaches, and the ocean, all depicted in the beauty of the different seasons. Because Ginkgo is always traveling, the series is the perfect remedy for wanderlust because each episode features a different part of Japan's landscape. It's pretty telling that the anime's opening doesn't feature any characters, not even Ginkgo, it's only shots of nature. As for the Mushi, this may depend on how high your tolerance is for supernatural body horror, but despite what should by all rights be nightmare fuel-inducing imagery, it just isn't upsetting. And there are a couple of reasons for this. There aren't any jump scares, no over-the-top screaming, or general anime tropey shenanigans. Even when a mushi is fatal for its host, it often does so slowly over time and almost never causes them intense pain or agony. The symptoms are usually just mildly distressing. The series doesn't relish in the suffering of these people. In one episode, a mushi causes snow to perpetually fall on its host, stopping him from feeling cold and causing even low heat to feel unbearably hot to him. But what contributes the most to creating such a peaceful atmosphere, by far, has to be the music. The soundtrack has this haunting, slightly forlorn, yet ethereal sound to it. And because the music is so gentle, it ends up creating this feeling of wonder towards the mushi, even when something that should be considered disturbing is happening. Besides, Ginkgo being what is essentially a supernatural doctor also lends to the aspect of healing. Sure, the patient's situation may be bad now, but there's a good chance that Ginkgo can help, and if not entirely cure them, at least improve their current living situation. Also, there's usually some sort of separate underlying problem or trauma that is only being aggravated by the presence of the mushi. Which means Ginkgo will often talk his patients through their problems or convince them to accept treatment before they can start the healing process. And I'm realizing just now that the reason the series is so healing is because it's basically about supernatural therapy. So that's pretty neat. Mushi-Shi is in the weird state where it technically has 2 anime adaptations, one in 2005 and one in 2014. But since they're made by the same studio and director, they effectively function as a season 1 and 2 with several specials and one movie. Which I only mention because it makes trying to watch them in chronological order without a guide a bit of a pain. Unlike many series that have a 10-year gap, the difference in quality is practically indistinguishable because the original anime is surprisingly fluid. It features a lot of slow, subtle movements and expressions and overall has aged very gracefully. Mushi-Shi is absolutely a standout series, especially if you're a seasoned anime fan, as it's just extremely refreshing and so unlike the typical anime experience. I would recommend watching at least the first 2 episodes to see if it's your thing, as it is a series that you kind of have to be in the right headspace for. My favorite episodes tend to revolve around mushi that become very human-like and focus on family. Not necessarily happy episodes, but hopeful and cathartic. Delightful Moomin family. I've talked about the Moomins at length in another video, but I would be remiss to ignore them here because they are extremely healing. The Moomins were created as a series of children's books and later comic strips by Swedish-speaking Finnish author Tove Jansson. Moomin Valley is inspired by Tove's childhood family vacations in Sweden, which means that the Moomin family lives like they're in a perma vacation. No jobs, no school, just peaceful, lazy days. While the family mostly stays in Moomin Valley, they sometimes go on adventures out on the open ocean and exploring different islands. Besides, the valley nestled deep within the mountains is huge and features all kinds of different terrain, like rivers, fields of flowers, forests, and caves. One of the most notable aspects about Moomin Valley is the importance placed on the changing of the seasons, as the valley is buried in snow every winter, turning the landscape into a frozen, unforgiving tundra. Which isn't really a problem for the locals, as they have adapted to simply hibernate until spring. Moomin Troll is best friends with Snufkin, a vagabond that doesn't hibernate and travels south during the winter. Much of the emotional crux is placed on Moomin's relationship with Snufkin and their relationships to the seasons. The joy and revelry in spring as everything is alive and new, and then summer's end as it transitions into fall, followed by the worries of the inevitable partings in winter. In regard to the healing aspect, I think Moomin Mama is an underrated standout and absolutely carries Moomin House. As opposed to Moomin Papa, who is a bit of a worrier, Moomin Mama always seems to have everything under control. When Moomin Papa is alarmed at seeing the kids flying on some magic clouds, he goes to Moomin Mama, who calmly tells him not to worry as she's already told the children to be careful so they don't fall. When Moomin Troll is transformed into a strange creature and is having a panic attack because no one recognizes him, it's Mama that firmly tells him that there's no need to worry, because if he's actually her son, of course she'll recognize him. And of course she does, which turns him back to normal. Her gentle manner and calm attitude to any situation is very soothing, and she simply exudes household comfort and safety. Moomin House is a safe space open to any guest seeking shelter, like Ninny, a child who became invisible from neglect, or Thingamy and Bob, who are running away from the Groke. The Moomins is the perfect series to watch when you're totally exhausted and just want to turn your brain off and relax. It's kind of amazing that once I finally had context and a name to put to this previously unnamed thing I had been desperately searching for, it meant that I could start intentionally looking for different examples of iyashikei. And like a puzzle, so many of these seemingly separate pieces formed into one solid picture. So I hope this video also helped to provide you with some clarity. I feel like what exactly does and does not count as iyashikei is a little nebulous and hard to define. So if there is a series you personally find comforting and healing, please leave a comment about it. Some of you might be aware that I missed uploading last month's video, so I want to thank everyone, and especially my patrons, who reached out and sent a kind message. I'm so grateful that you're the most patient and understanding people I could possibly ask for. And I know it probably sounds trite, but I literally couldn't do this without your support, so thank you. And with that being said, welcome to my new patrons, Big Boss, Jacob Wild, Brandon, and Allie. Thank you so much. Alright, I'm signing out, and I just want to let you know that everything's gonna be okay.